Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to have the chance to speak to so many wonderful Europeans, I have to say. What I'll talk a little bit about is how ISDS can threaten and frustrate government action on climate change. So the general problem is that ISDS, investor-state dispute settlement, gives large companies, large resource companies, large oil companies, very powerful new tool to pressure governments, especially behind the scenes, because they can raise the prospect of potentially huge amounts of financial liability associated with proposed decisions that would not otherwise be present. And they're the only ones who can do it. Future generations can't bring that threat. Existing generations can't make that claim unless they're foreign owners of assets who have deep enough pockets to spend millions of dollars on an ISDS claim. In other words, unless they're a foreign investor who is typically a very wealthy individual or a very large multinational. And the way it would tend to work is government officials at some level would be considering a proposal. And we can imagine all different kinds of proposals that might be associated with climate change action. I'll give an example from the Canadian context, because Canada in the last 9 years has been arguably the worst country in the world on the issue of global climate change, and that's a very embarrassing and negative part of our country's recent history, which can be laid squarely at the foot of our outgoing Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who comes from the oil-rich, I should say, we might say tar sands rich or oil sands rich province of Alberta, who made policy decisions while in power that I, as a Canadian, can only explain by equating Stephen Harper with the oil industry. In particular, the decision of Canada to actually withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol was shocking to many Canadians, including myself, not in accord with what we understood our country to stand for internationally. We withdrew, of course, after taking part in the negotiations and evidently using that opportunity to weaken the content of the Kyoto Protocol, and then withdrew. So a particularly absurd and cynical approach taken, which flies absolutely in the face in the aspirations of Canada to be a good citizen. So many of us in Canada are truly rejoicing that Stephen Harper is gone. And we have a new government where at least there is, and you should feel welcome to join us in that celebration. But many of us did launch fireworks on the evening of the election when it was clear that Harper was gone. Now, Harper is replaced with another imperfect government, far less imperfect than the outgoing government. One where there at least is a glimmer of hope that there will be a commitment to changes. I think there's a reasonable prospect of a national carbon tax, for example, in Canada. I'm just going to give a specific example, which is related to pipelines. So the oil industry, in its wisdom, decided to sink tens of billions of dollars of assets into the exploitation and production of a resource in a landlocked area. Therefore dependent on being able to transport the resource to seawater. And they've been transporting it by truck, and they've been transporting it by rail, much to the very tragic misfortune of the people of Lac Mégantic in Quebec, where there was a horrific rail explosion which killed dozens of people. And due to linked at least to an explosion of transport of oil by rail in Canada in just a few years. They've also been shipping it, of course, by pipelines, but really, at least until the most recent collapse of the oil price, they were desperate for more pipelines, and there are 3 pipelines in the works. The most controversial one is called the Northern Gateway Pipeline, sometimes called the Enbridge Pipeline. And it would run from Alberta through to the west. So if you're looking at a map, you would going this way on the map of Canada, and it would run through British Columbia, West Coast province to the Pacific. And it would run through a lot of land that is subject to outstanding Aboriginal land claims because it was historically never ceded in treaties. It would run through a lot of environmentally sensitive areas, especially on the coast. The oil tankers would have to make their way through quite hazardous and dangerous areas of the coast. Oil spill is a significant risk. And this pipeline is unpopular in British Columbia and became a matter of political discussion. And in the course of that discussion, especially about 3 years ago in the run-up to a provincial election, different political parties took different positions in opposition to the proposals for that pipeline. They said one position was taken by the New Democratic Party, which looked like it was going to win the election, ended up not winning. The New Democratic Party said, well, we won't allow this pipeline through British Columbia without a made in British Columbia environmental assessment process to approve the pipeline, a new process, because we don't necessarily trust the federal approvals process. And the Liberal Party at the time said, well, if we're not happy with the deal for British Columbia from this pipeline, we will consider cutting off energy to this pipeline, supplied through BC Hydro, publicly owned utility. And that's the way we'll block this pipeline to make sure British Columbia's interests are protected. At which point I immediately thought, I wonder about ISDS at this stage. Okay. There are 2 arguments that would come from these proposals behind the scenes, I expect, on the part of lobbyists or lawyers for large oil companies. And there are large foreign oil companies involved in the proposals for that pipeline. One argument would be, well, ISDS provisions, foreign investor protections provisions, have been interpreted broadly by many arbitrators to provide rights to compensation when the regulatory framework is changed. A very broad right of effectively public insurance against the risks of democracy. And that to me seemed to be a potential for an order of liability based on a new made in British Columbia regulatory environmental assessment process, for example. The other proposal to cut off energy to the pipeline was even more dangerous from the point of view of ISDS because that's discriminatory treatment. If you cut off energy to a foreign-owned pipeline but not a domestically owned pipeline in the same province, you're at serious risk of ISDS liability. Not 100% that you would lose, but certainly a viable claim. Now what happens? I mean, well, behind the scenes, if governments are aware of these risks, and they do have lawyers internally who are aware of these issues, and if the lawyers aren't aware of it, they at a certain point are going to hear about it from lawyers for the corporations. The governments have to think, well, what might be our liability? I'm cutting off energy to a multi-billion-dollar pipeline. That may very well block the pipeline. I'm going to deny approvals to the pipeline based on this new environmental assessment process. That may very well block a pipeline that was otherwise ready to go, otherwise approved through the existing federal approvals process, then in the hands of the Harper government. So then what happens? Well, I may be on the hook for whatever those foreign investors have put into that pipeline proposal. Maybe millions, maybe hundreds of millions, maybe billions, but there's more. How much money would they have earned from the flow of the oil? Quickly we head into billions of dollars of potential liability. Now, do you think that might affect a government's decision making? As a taxpayer, I have to say, I certainly hope so. But as a voter, I say, oh dear, that's not very satisfactory. The voter very concerned about climate change and very concerned as a Canadian about the thought of all that oil buried in the oil sands in Alberta actually being burned, making the policy objective of keeping climate change, a rise in climate change to the 2% average that's a widely agreed target is impossible. the policy targets on climate change translate into a requirement that most of the unconventional oil, especially oil, but other fossil fuel reserves, not be burned, simple as that. So those attempting to frustrate pipelines do have an ulterior motive, which is to try to find a way to keep those resources in the ground. For, the passing reason that they actually want to try to avoid significant risk to future human civilization and just a minor concern. Of course, I'm being facetious. In other words, ISDS directly conflicts with perhaps the most pressing policy objective we face as a country in Canada and as a world. And I'm not an expert in climate change, I'll be clear, but I do follow the issue, and I'm deeply, deeply worried about it for my children, for my grandchildren. I'm sure all of you are too. So when I do think about my expertise in ISDS, I think, how can we get that tool for frustrating necessary steps to protect humanity and human civilization from very serious risks? How can we remove that obstacle? And the idea was to draft a carve-out for a multilateral climate change agreement, which would preclude resort to ISDS in any existing treaty that allows it. You can do that with one new treaty. That's the beauty of it. One new treaty can wipe out ISDS in thousands of existing treaties between states that are all also a party to the new treaty. Okay? So in the new treaty, the countries that agree in a multilateral climate change convention to carve out ISDS, they can do that for all of their existing treaties. They can't do it for a country that doesn't sign the new treaty, because they haven't, replaced their past agreement. But with a multilateral convention, that's a lot of states, and legally it's possible. Politically, extremely difficult, but why not try? So I wrote the strongest possible carve-out I could imagine. And I ran it by a few friends and said, can we make it stronger? They said, I think you could let's put it in. The strongest possible carve-out. So if a government says, we have a strong carve-out, I urge you to compare it to the long 4-paragraph carve-out that I, with some help of some others, designed to make it so that climate change action would be safeguarded from any of these threats from big oil companies and big resource companies. And if you think oil companies wouldn't use ISDS, well, they already have. They've already recovered awards running into the billions of dollars. They have very good lawyers, and a lot of them. Chevron reportedly has spent, I believe it's over $400 million fighting one ISDS case against Ecuador. So they have lots of access to lawyers if they want. And when I reviewed ISDS cases up to, this is cut off in the spring of 2010, among the most common themes of the decision-making that was attacked in ISDS was resource disputes and health and environmental disputes. Just think about the tar sands themselves. To fully develop the tar sands, as I recall, the numbers around $200 billion worth of investment in new infrastructure required for assets worth vastly in excess of that in the ground if actually exploited and sold. So this is actually hitting hundreds of billions or potentially trillions of dollars in assets. Now, if there's too generous an approach to public compensation of the losers of those assets because of climate change action, my worry is climate change action becomes financially unfeasible. I have to admit, there's going to be some huge amount of compensation involved for it to happen at all. And unfortunately, that's a cost the public is going to have to bear because of the risks. But those, ISDS has the potential to ratchet up the level of compensation required to something simply impossible. And that's obviously not acceptable. for anyone who takes climate change with the seriousness that it deserves. Thank you very much.